Welcome to Choose You This Day, Lesson 7. If you found me randomly on the internet, this is part 7 of a full series of 21 different lessons of a class called Choose You This Day. This is being offered at the chapel in Akron, Ohio. If you've been following along with the course or maybe even attending and you've come to this point in the videos, you're going to think this looks really different, and that's because we're re-recording this one. During the course of the class, we've tried to record them so that people can follow along when they're not there, but there were 4 lessons throughout this year that were all really poor audio recordings, or something happened with the audio to cause it to be really difficult to listen to. So here I am in my house trying to redo these. I've never done this without a live audience before, so I'm doing my best with the camera here. I'm going to be pretending that that camera is my good friends who previously were sitting out in the room with me. So that's why I'm picturing in my mind. I'm not an actor or anything, so I'm just going to be presenting lesson 7 for you, and hopefully this will keep the continuity going and allow you to keep up with the course if you're not able to be there. So welcome, and here we are, lesson 7. We've been building up to this point really throughout the course. We started with 4 lessons about God's plan for humanity, and then we did the enemy, who he is, who he's not, and we did a lesson on spiritual warfare, what demons are, what they can and can't do, that sort of thing. And we're going to be progressing today by talking about the Watchers, the sons of God. And this really comes, it begins to come from Genesis chapter 6, the very beginning, which if you've read that before, you've been reading along in Genesis maybe and thought, what in the world is going on here at the beginning of chapter 6? It's very unusual. And the way that you actually interpret this passage is going to affect the way that you interpret lots of other things in the whole entire Bible. So let me read these opening verses 1 through 4, and give some context for what we're going to be talking about today. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So there are several different explanations for what's going on here. What really happened between these sons of God and these daughters of men, and who were they? So we're going to look briefly at the 3 that I think have the most credibility. And I do believe that the preponderance of evidence really supports the idea that what we're talking about is spiritual beings coming from another dimension, from the heavenly realm, the spiritual realm, and taking on human-like bodies and being able to be on this earth, interacting with human women, marrying them, having sex with them, and having children by them. I know that may sound bizarre if it's the first time you've ever heard of that, but I do think that the most evidence really supports that. So I just want to tell you from the very beginning, that's where we're headed today, is giving the evidence supporting that, and then eventually getting into issues of why is this even important to look at a passage like this that's kind of maybe enigmatic. Yet you really have to take the whole rest of the course to find out some of the implications for this and how we understand Scripture, but we'll give you the introduction to the idea today. So what I believe about this matter actually does influence how I believe Satan can interact with this world. And when I say Satan, I'm always talking about the leader of a whole kingdom. So it's easier to say Satan than Satan and all of his forces and demons and Elohim and all those kinds of things. So we're kind of using Satan as representative of his whole evil kingdom. So I need you to know that really intelligent, godly people have come to very different conclusions about this matter of what's going on here in Genesis 6, and you can be a godly person, a true believer, a lover of Jesus Christ, and come to different conclusions than I am today. But as we try to understand what God's doing throughout the Old Testament and why the Israelite people are doing what they're doing, I do think that this is the best explanation, and we'll see how that plays into the rest of it. So, like anything though, don't take my word for it. You know, if this bothers you, look it up, find out, look at the evidence for yourself. It's a good exercise. I'm always about getting people into Scripture by maybe starting with things you're interested in. And this is certainly a very interesting topic that you won't have trouble being curious about. So that's one of the good things about it. But realize that making up your mind ahead of time before you've really examined the evidence isn't a good way to find discoveries, right? You've already made up your mind, you're not going to be able to learn anything. So realize that when somebody else's interpretation of Scripture makes you uncomfortable, that's actually an opportunity to investigate further and learn more, and that can be a really good thing. The Bereans were commended by Paul. It was this group of people that lived in Berea, and he said about them, "Now these Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so." So Paul commended them for examining Scriptures for themselves when they heard something that was different from what they'd heard before. They looked at it for themselves. So that's what I would encourage you. I'm introducing a topic, and you can find a lot more about that on different YouTube videos and things, but I'm going to introduce it to you, and if it makes you curious or uncomfortable, continue to look further, find out. We're going to see how when you put the evidence on the scales, I believe it weighs quite strongly in favor of where I'm leading you today. So in this lesson, I'm really going to take you through the journey of how I came to embrace this supernatural view of Genesis chapter 6, especially verses 1 and 2, but 1 through 4 in totality. So in essence, it really does come down to that matter of weighing the evidence and seeing which way it falls. So before we really can proceed with this exploration, though, I do have to mention the use that I'm going to be using some sources that are not in the Bible. And in my tradition, very kind of strict evangelical tradition, some people think very negatively about even looking at sources outside of the Bible to try to find information about it. So I want to really make a case that it's useful to do this, to look at things other than the Bible itself. Some Christians like to say, we should only ever read the Bible. We should only ever look at the Bible for information. And that we shouldn't look at any other texts, other religious texts, other historical texts, because they're not reliable. So I do perfectly agree that those other sources aren't on the same level as Scripture. They're different from inspired Scripture, so we can't fully consider them to be reliable or infallible, but they do give us insight into what people of that day believed, what their worldview was, what they thought. We read history books, we read newspapers. Those are biased, we know those are biased sources, and yet we can get factual information out of those too. And so I'm just proposing the use of other sources along those same lines. And that does need to be said for the tradition in which I come from, because not everybody thinks this is a good idea. So, even if the source that we're accessing, even if it's obvious mythology, like we know that story can't be true, it's still useful for us to get into the minds of the ancient person and see what is it that they believed are true. These become their working presuppositions, and so it's good for us to kind of be able to get into their heads. We believe the Bible then has the story in its unmythologized form. So we're always going to come back to that for the unmythologized true form of the story, but it's helpful to look at some of these other things. So just as an example of what I'm talking about, in case this is new to you, nearly every ancient culture's writings contain some version of a story of a great global flood, where there's this man who survives the flood like on a boat with his family. This is often followed by a story about like the division of their descendants down the line into different language groups, and that somehow the gods did this division. Usually it was in response to the building of some type of structure. So you probably recognize the story of the Tower of Babel in there. One example of a different culture that has a story like this is it's an Aztec myth from Central America, and it goes like this. Humanity was wiped out by a flood, but one man, Coxcoxtli, and one woman, Quetzalcoatl, escaped in a boat and reached a mountain called Culhuacan. They had many children who were dumb until the time when a dove on top of a tree made them the gift of languages. But these differed so much that the children could not understand each other. So we know the biblical account has a dove, and it has the boat, and a mountain, and it has a lot of the same elements, but this is a little different, isn't it? It's got the elements, but they're changed. We clearly know from the Genesis account what happened at the Tower of Babel, but and we take that to be the true inspired story, but these other accounts are helpful because they show us what other people around the world believed the truth to be. And people believed that the division of languages among humanity happened supernaturally. They attributed this to the gods. Somehow enemies or elements from outside of their realm, outside the physical realm, invaded into the physical realm and did something to affect the languages of mankind. That's in the histories of the world. And so this lends support actually to what the Bible says, even though the details have been changed. And it contradicts some pretty common anthropological explanations for how the languages came about, and kind of brings it back to, well, this is what people understood. That from earliest prehistory, before even writing, people understood that the nations had been divided by language by the gods. You know, a few historical sources are actually quoted by biblical authors. And these were found among copies of scripture in Qumran, where when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. There were other books, scrolls found there too, not just the Bible. I don't know if you know that. Some of these were not included in the Protestant canon of scripture when it was finalized. Sometimes that's because there was evidence of changes or alterations. Other times it's because there wasn't consensus as to whether these should be considered inspired or not. But they can still be very useful to provide more information, really to show us what people of the day thought, or maybe what had been passed down by oral traditions in different cultures. The quotations in the Bible show us, when they quote these other sources, they show us that the biblical authors were familiar with some of those outside works, and that they considered them to be reliable at the time of their writing. One of those is directly applicable to what we're talking about today, and it's called the Book of Watchers, also known as the Book of 1st Enoch. And Jude actually quotes this book. He says in Jude verses 14 and 15, "It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So that's a quotation that Jude is inserting from the book of 1st Enoch. It proves that he was familiar with that text, and it proves that he at least considered that section of it to be reliable. That doesn't mean he considered it to be inspired scripture. He just thought it was a historical account. So much of what modern scholarship believes and understands about non-satanic and evil entities, like the bad guys who aren't the devil himself, prior to the New Testament, actually a lot of it comes from that particular source, 1st Enoch. It gives a lot of detail about that circumstance that we found there in Genesis chapter 6. If the book of 1st Enoch could be proven to be historically reliable, and it could be proven to have its origins somewhere back in the actual Enoch of the book of Genesis, it would really put to rest what we think might be happening here in Genesis 6, because it's talking about that time period and it's so clear that it was a supernatural thing. But it's really not that easy though, because this work was written in Hebrew about 2 centuries before Christ. Those are the oldest copies we have. It wasn't written pre-flood like we would expect if Enoch himself had actually written it down. So at very best, it contains things that Enoch said that were passed on by oral tradition. It's not his writing. It can't be, because it's not old enough to be his writing. So it's not that simple really to trace it back to Enoch. So the confusion actually increases when we learn that, there's a whole bunch of different documents that are given credit to Enoch or put under his name one way or the other. And they're very, very different from each other. So 1st Enoch can be very useful for matters of grammar and vocabulary. I do believe it's an important work to consider, because it demonstrates conclusively what people 200 years before Christ at least thought about what was happening there in Genesis chapter 6. They believed that angels were procreating with humans, is the bottom line of it. And so they attributed this to the time and the teaching of Enoch, whether they actually think that he had a hand in the writing at all, or maybe just spoke it and taught it and it was from his time. But the fact that Jude quotes from it actually forces us to consider that possibility, even though debates are always going to rage about what's been changed, what's been added, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to see what some other historical sources as well as that one have to say later on. But first I want to look real briefly at the alternative interpretations of Genesis 6. If it wasn't like an incursion of supernatural beings with humans, what else could it have been? And I have to really skim through this because of time. I don't want to make you be here forever, even though you're just watching on video. So I do have notes for all of the course, really, very, very detailed notes if you haven't found them yet. I've actually put the link in the comments at the bottom of the YouTube video, so you can find the link to my website where all the PDFs are stored. You can follow along with this, and I'm going to be very much skimming through this, so if you want more of the supportive details, you can look there for it. Plus, lots of other places have this. But the first view to consider is that the sons of God mentioned there in Genesis chapter 6 are the male line of Seth. And so this is actually the predominant view that's been taught in recent years in evangelical seminaries regarding who the sons of God actually are. It says they were godly males from the line of Seth. And the sin being described in the passage then would be either polygamy or intermarriage between the godly men and the ungodly women. So there are some strengths to that line of arguing. I've listed them all here for you. I am skimming, okay, told you that, right? So there's some strengths to it. There are some weaknesses to it as well. I'm actually going to be covering some of that. When I give the support for the angelic view, it's going to handle some of the strengths and weaknesses. So really going to just pass over that for now in the notes, and you can look there for the support. The second view to consider is that the sons of God are royalty, and then the daughters of men would be commoners. And so this makes a note of the fact that royal people of the ancient Near East, the time of the Old Testament, were often considered to be part divine. That's how people believed, that the rulers were kind of part God. And so it's common in royal descriptions of the time to find that a king claimed to have divine heritage. So the idea is, since they called themselves the flesh of the gods, we can interpret that when it says the sons of God married the daughters of men, that it's the biblical account is referring to those royal people. So the sin then would be that they're taking any women they wanted for their own sexual use, regardless of whether the women were married or who they belonged to. In some accounts, it seems that the king had the right of the first night with a new bride. So she'd marry her husband, but she'd spend the first night with the king and then be given to her husband. So that's one way of looking, and that would be preposterous. Obviously, it's not something God would approve of, so that would be bad. The royals would be setting a very bad example. The whole world would be following their example, necessitating the flood. So that's the line of argument. Again, there's a bunch of strengths to this, and there's a bunch of weaknesses to this. Which basically I think will be addressed as we talk about the strengths of the supernatural view. We're kind of combating some of the weaknesses of the others. So those are two of them. The third one would be the supernatural view that I'm going to be talking about. But I do want to give a little variation first, before we move on, about who the sons of God were. There's a combination of views that kind of warrants a brief look, and that's the idea that the sons of God were actually human men that had demons inhabiting them, and so when they married women, they were in effect having sex with women. So it's a supernatural idea, but it's like demonically possessed men were having sex with the women, and so it really would be human with human, though. And I think it acknowledges that there's something supernatural going on here, but I just can't really go with this idea because of what follows with the offspring of these unions turns out to be seen as something more than just human. It really doesn't address the major concerns. I don't think it solves anything. So it's a popular view because it kind of combines the two, and it doesn't have to go quite so far as the weirdness of saying these angels married women, right? But I don't think it really does the job of explaining it fully. So let me go into the idea that these are supernatural beings and what the support for that is. So it's important for me to kind of bring you to that conclusion with me. Even if you don't end up agreeing with me, I'm going to be giving the support for that along the way. So I hope to accomplish, at least, even if you don't agree with me, that you'd be able to see why people think this. Like, why have people come to this conclusion, and how are the objections to it handled? So that's what I'll spend the time doing today, as well as, like I said, going on into why this even matters to us today. So first I'm going to answer like the major flow of objections to the argument, and then I'm going to give some further support for the point of view. So again, it's not like by skimming over the strengths and weaknesses of the other two arguments that I'm minimizing any of that. It is important for you to look at if you're bothered by this. It's just that the focus of this class and where we're headed, it's more important for me to give what I think is the correct point of view and to be able to spend our time fleshing that out. So one of the first objections to this idea is the thought that, well, angels can't reproduce. And so this directly comes from Mark chapter 12, verse 25. There's a cross-reference with Matthew 22:30 there. And it says, when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. So, that passage is generally used as the first line of defense against this idea that angels procreated with humans. I mean, doesn't it say there that angels don't get married and they're non-sexual beings? But notice the descriptive phrase about the angels that don't marry. It says angels in heaven don't marry. So that does leave room for the possibility that angels could leave heaven and marry human women on the earth. And so, but that sort of seems a little desperate, right? I'm just pulling at straws here. I'm, picking things apart. But we do need to see if there's any support for that. So let's look at the parallel passage in the book of Luke. This is chapter 20, 34 to 36. It says, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die anymore, because they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So Jesus there is answering the challenge of the Sadducees who claim that there's no resurrection. That's the context of his argument here. And he's directly refuting their belief that there's no resurrection by giving them some information about what it will be like for these humans who will be resurrected, these believers who are eventually resurrected and get new bodies. He makes the shocking statement, which maybe they've never even heard before, that in their resurrected state, they will be equal to angels and they're going to have the status of sons of God. Boy, in the next lesson, you'll see a little bit more of what a big deal that is. For now, kind of hold that thought that in the resurrection, believing humans are known as the sons of God. Well, the context here in the Gospels in Jesus defeating the Sadducees' argument is clearly post-resurrection. We're talking about humans after they've been resurrected are like the angels in heaven. It's not talking about anything pre-flood. It's not talking about what angels could or couldn't do pre-flood. We're talking about sometime in the future. So we can't use this passage to claim that angels never could have married, never could have left their bodies. All we know for sure, their heavenly bodies I should say, all we know for sure is that angels in heaven in the eternal kingdom do not marry, and neither will we, okay? Even though we marry now, we won't then. Things will be different in that stage. The entire point of the passage is not to try to give us some description of the sexual capabilities of angels. It's really, it's not to show us can angels even pass on their seed to anything else. It's to show that there surely will be resurrection from the dead, and that in the new order, things are going to be different than they are now. There's not going to be any need for procreation in the new earth because, everyone's going to have an immortal, resurrected body, and the physical population isn't going to need to be maintained by the birth of children like it is now. So things will be different in the eternal kingdom. That's going to be an entirely different context than the one that we see in Genesis 6. And so that renders these passages describing angels in heaven inapplicable. Well, I think we still need a little bit more to make the case, so let me continue. Jude, who is the half-brother of Jesus, he states that his purpose for writing his letter at all is to contend for the faith against false teachers. And these false teachers, he says, they're perverting the grace of our God into sensuality and denying Christ. As an example of the severity of God's judgment against those who reject God, Jude mentions how God rescued his people from slavery and afterwards he destroyed unbelieving Egypt. So he gives that example. Then he gives another example, which he assumes his readers are familiar with because he offers no other explanation for this. This is the most bizarre thing completely out of context. You might have noticed it when you read in Jude. It says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. That's Jude verse 6. The word there for habitation, that angels did not, they left their proper dwelling or their habitation, is the Greek word oikaterion. And it's only found here in Jude and again in 2 Corinthians 5:2. And that verse is directly talking about the habitation or house that we are earnestly seeking to be clothed in after our resurrection, after this life. It says, for in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. Oikaterion. It's the only other use of that word in the New Testament. So oikaterion in both cases is referring to a dwelling place above and beyond the constraints of our human Adamic bodies. It's talking about an immortal body. So the angels in the Jude passage, they didn't stay in their oikaterion, in their immortal body, but they left the place where they belonged. They received a severe punishment for doing so, and the punishment was to be chained up in darkness until Judgment Day. That's pretty severe. Well, one way that we know that Jude was talking about the Genesis 6 incident is he goes on to quote the book of 1 Enoch, like we showed you already. And this book, 1 Enoch, goes into great detail about the immortal beings that left heaven. Enoch calls them the Watchers. And they left heaven. It says in 1 Enoch that they taught many things to mankind. They engaged in genetic experiments with plants and animals. A key point in 1 Enoch is that the great sin of the Watchers was that they married human women and had children by them who were half God and half human. So that is what 1 Enoch claims, and that is the book that Jude is referring to and directly quoting actually in his epistle. Well, if it were just Jude, we might go, well, maybe somebody messed up putting that in there. Well, let's be careful about that. But Peter actually confirms this. So Peter provides kind of a second witness that this is what Jude is talking about, and that he's even talking about that time period before the flood. This is what it says in 2 Peter 2, 4, and 5. Another passage that is likely to be skipped over when you're reading this because it just sounds so weird. It says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, ... He keeps on going from there. But he's clearly referring to the time of Noah as he talks about the sin of the angels. He's putting it into the historical context. The same sin that Jude is talking about, it's almost the exact same wording. The angels sinned and they're chained up now in chains of gloomy darkness. So both Jude and Peter assume that their readers know what they're talking about. The wording just seems odd and random to us as modern readers, but when it's this weird and they don't say what's going on, we can assume that the first century readers knew the context of what they were talking about. It'd be as if I were referring to a modern cultural story that everybody sort of had in our collective minds, that we know what the cultural reference is. They're giving a cultural reference to something that people understood. So, when we read the epistles, we tend to assume, they just have special revelation from God. That's how they put that in there. But they wouldn't have just thrown out these tidbits that are very odd without helping explain for their readers. They were referring to common historical documents that everybody knew about. Even Jude says, I'm quoting Enoch, okay? And so we know what they have in front of them when they're doing that. Well, as for this question about do angels even have the capability of reproducing? Okay, so maybe they can leave their immortal bodies and take on human bodies, but can they even reproduce? Is that even possible? Because that's one of the objections to the idea that this is what happened in Genesis 6, is that, they can't even reproduce, can they? Well, we can make a few observations. For one thing, angels look like men when they appear to people. They often have to tell people, don't be afraid when they see them, but they're never described as having wings or looking anything like the depiction of angels that are real common in our culture. Let me give you examples from Abraham. This is Genesis 18, verse 2. It says, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. It says men. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. And then a little bit later in verse 8, he says, then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared. So what happened to the food after they ate it? If these guys can leave heaven and appear on the earth as men and eat food, isn't it possible that they could also engage in other types of physical activities? In fact, 2 of these same men later entered Sodom, and they're nearly attacked by the residents of Sodom who wanted to commit sexual sin with them. So is it possible that maybe they were instantly recognized to be immortals of some kind? I mean, Abraham seemed to recognize that something unusual was going on here. Even though they look like men, they might look like special men. I wonder if part of the attraction in Sodom and Gomorrah was this remembered understanding that once these immortal gods had left heaven and had come to earth, and maybe they recognized that, oh, maybe this is happening again. And last time this happened, at least according to Enoch, these guys were giving humans special knowledge about things, and so maybe they were seeking some of that. We can't really be conclusive about answers to any of those, but it makes the case that we just can't conclude that supernatural beings aren't capable of physical things like reproducing. If they have the plumbing for digesting food, they could have other plumbing as well to reproduce and have children. So these entities are called spiritual beings because they don't originate from earth. They are not made of the earth like Adam was. Their bodies aren't made of the dust of the earth, but they seem to be able to assume physical form according to the text. It's not their normal state. Humans, just to reverse it, humans could go to the spiritual realm at times. We see that in Isaiah chapter 6, where he's transported to the throne room of God and sees that. We see in 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul went to the third heaven and saw it. It's like he's transported to another place. They don't usually exist in that plane, but they can go there. And so we could say the same of the angelic beings. We also see times that they are interacting, where angelic spiritual beings can interact with the physical stuff of earth. An angel from God struck down many people after David took the census in 2 Samuel 24. How about in Daniel chapter 6 when God's angel shuts the mouth of lions? I mean, the angel can do something to a physical thing. That's the case that we're making. And an angel struck Peter's side to wake him up, and he caused the chains to fall off him, and he got out of prison. That's in Acts chapter 12. So angels can do stuff relating to the physical realm. For us to claim that there's no way that they could have done this with human women is really to make a claim we have no evidence. In fact, we have more evidence to the contrary. So to review so far, we've noted that angels in heaven do not marry, but we've asked whether they can leave heaven and appear in bodies that can physically interact with creation. So in response, we found a specific passage in the book of Jude that mentions angels leaving their proper habitation. We've connected that to a passage in 1 Corinthians that uses that same word that means immortal body. So the angels left their immortal bodies and did something. We also have a passage in 1 Peter that uses the same wording as Jude to describe some angels' sin and the punishment that was allotted to them, but it also unequivocally connects that particular sin to these entities at the time of Noah, just prior to Noah's flood. Finally, we've shown that at least one time when angels appeared on earth, they ate food, which can't be done by a purely spiritual, non-physical entity. And we've seen other examples in which things originate in the spirit realm, but they can make a physical impact on the earthly realm. Now, in the next lesson, lesson 8, we're going to add to this case by looking at an instance in which God punishes immortal beings by reducing them to mortality. That'll be found in Psalm 82, so you have to stay tuned for that one. Well, if these entities did reproduce, wouldn't it have to be like according to their own kind? I find this to be a very compelling question that needs to be answered if we're going to make this claim. I mean, you look at nature and you go, cats breed with cats, they don't breed with dogs. Giraffes don't breed with elephants, you don't get crosses in species. So how could angels breed with humans and have children with them? Let's look at Genesis 1:24 and 25. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So I agree wholeheartedly that the mixing of kinds is almost always a very bad idea, and it doesn't happen in nature. So there's only actually one time that I know of where this was a good idea, and it was initiated by God himself. And this was the time that he mixed his own seed with the seed of a human woman, and God became man. This is when the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary and caused her to become pregnant with a child that was both the seed of God and her own human seed. So this example shows us that a non-terrestrial being, in this case God, could combine DNA with a human, and that the result would be something rather unusual. In this case, it was the Son of God himself. So one might argue that only God can do this. Very, very good point to raise for consideration, but it's not certain that only God can do it. We simply don't know exactly what the abilities of those sons of God were at the time. What abilities were they given? What did they know about science that could allow them to accomplish this? What were their bodies like that they took on themselves when they left their proper habitation? What we can be sure of is that only the Creator has the right to do this. And so it was an extreme violation when they did it. Okay, if that's what was happening in Genesis 6, this would have been extremely offensive to God, that his creatures would take it upon themselves to make something other than what he had designed. And that would be why the punishment was so severe for what they did. So, just to talk about words here before we move on, I want to keep making the case that this was a supernatural incursion, but I need to define some terms. I've been already mixing some terms up and using some terms loosely. So I just want to kind of stop here and define a few things so that we're on the same page in our understanding. So the first word I want to talk about is angel. And usually we use that word to define a celestial being, something of a spiritual nature. It lives in heaven or in a different dimension. It's not made of the dust of the earth like humans, right? Angels, the whole idea of an angel is often connected with the idea that they're God's messengers. So we generally understand that they somehow can interact with our world, but the Bible doesn't really tell us anything about the mechanics of how do they get to be invisible sometimes and they're visible other times. Sometimes they have physical substance, sometimes they don't seem to. Angel's a really easy word to use, and I use it sometimes, and it's actually the English word that the Greek word gets translated into in the New Testament. So it's common to use the word angel for a supernatural being in a more general sense. So that's a common usage of it, and I do it sometimes too. But we would then sort of think, well, there's different kinds of angels, right? There's things like cherubim and seraphim and archangels. There's good angels, there's fallen angels, there's these guys called the sons of God. All of those could be loosely called angels, and there may be some overlap in some of that. So for example, what we call fallen angels might be the sons of God, as in Genesis 6 and elsewhere, which again, we'll talk about some more of that terminology next week. But likely though, there are sons of God who are still loyal to God and didn't do these sins or some of the other sins. So those would be good angels, I suppose. So the point is, the word angels is easy to say, but it really isn't the most descriptive term. I think of sons of God as sort of a class of angel. They can appear as men. They're different from cherubim and seraphim. I don't find evidence in Scripture to help us identify for certain whether like an archangel like Michael would be one of the sons of God. We just don't know all the details of that. Is he one of the classes of angels, or is he something different all on his own? Was Satan an angel? Was he an archangel? The Bible actually doesn't tell us those kinds of things. So I believe it's accurate to call Satan a fallen angel if we mean, well, he's a celestial being of spiritual origin, he's from a different dimension, and he's in rebellion against God. Then sure, let's call him a fallen angel. But just so you know, technically the word angel actually has the connotation of a messenger along with it. That's what the Hebrew word for angel actually means, is messenger. So there you go. I guess I'm just admitting that it's a little bit complicated, and so allow me please sometimes to say angel, even though it might be more general than is helpful. The next word I want to talk about is God, and when we use God with a lowercase g, What we mean is it's a being of supernatural powers or attributes believed in and worshipped by a people, especially a male deity thought to control some part of nature or reality. So there's your official definition. Angels can be gods, right? The thing that makes them gods is they're worshipped by people. That's why we call them divine beings. That can be really confusing to us as Christians because we know there's only one God, we say with a capital G. So how can I say there's other gods with a lowercase g? To make it perfectly clear, there is only one creator. There's only one Yahweh. There's only one God who made everything else. He made even these other creatures who have different powers than humans do. They have different attributes than humans do. It's not as though Yahweh and the lowercase g gods are of the same essence as each other. There's nothing like Yahweh. Any lowercase g gods that there are, he's made them and allowed them to serve a purpose. It's not like they're the same thing, but Yahweh is just the highest ranking of all of them. He is very completely other of anything else that he made. If the gods, the lowercase g gods, are similar to Yahweh, it's because he made them to model those qualities after himself. Just like he made humans in his image, he made these other spiritual beings to reflect certain qualities of himself or to do certain jobs, any of that. So yeah, when God made humans in his image, but we still are not Yahweh, right? We're not him. And he's sovereign over everything. We're never going to be equal with him. He's always going to be in charge. That means he ultimately decides what any created being can or cannot do. Yet, in his brilliance and his desire for relationship with his creatures, he accomplishes his purposes while he also accommodates the ability for us to make decisions, for his creatures to make decisions and do meaningful things. Sometimes to make choices that might even be at odds with what he would prefer, but choices that he'll be able to use for his purposes. So, we don't know why some of these angelic beings, there's that word angels again, why they would have left their habitation and rebelled against God. We're not really given that why they might have done this. We know some of them did though, right? We know some of them did that. Because their powers and their knowledge are superior to humans, at least in maybe a scientific sense, maybe not an experiential, really knowing God sense, but as far as just knowledge, they seem to be quite superior to humans. And so they showed themselves to humans, and humans naturally came to worship them because they seem to be superior to us. And so humans came to think of these entities as gods. They created exaggerated stories about their powers. This is what we see in the mythologies of the world. These beings are in no way equal to God. They don't threaten God at all. He allows them to exist, and he even uses them for his purposes without being in the least bit threatened by what they do. So by calling them gods, or sometimes even using the phrase divine beings, we're only acknowledging that they're immortal, at least for now. They're supernatural beings that sometimes humans worship. That's what we're saying with the word gods with a lowercase g, okay? So when Yahweh commanded to his Israelites, "You shall have no other gods before me," he's not only talking about imaginary gods that people might carve out of stone or out of wood. He's not just talking about physical idols. He's talking about the physical entities behind those things. They're not supposed to worship any other beings. It's evidenced by the second commandment, actually, which includes this prohibition against worshiping images that look like heavenly beings. And, God repeatedly warns his people, don't worship the heavenly host. He's saying there's something more behind just the things that you create to represent these. There actually are entities that receive worship from humans, and we would call those the gods. So that's what I mean when I say gods, and you'll be able to know from the context whether we're talking about capital G or lowercase g. Just realize when we use the English word God, a lot of times it's our nature to assign attributes to that word, the attributes of Yahweh alone. Like, the word God does not mean omnipotent, omniscient, all of those qualities that only Yahweh is. We can use the word God to mean a lesser created being that Yahweh himself actually has sovereignty over. Okay, so let's talk about these sons of God in the Old Testament and what's going on there. So we've given some reasonable evidence that the passages generally used against the angel view of Genesis 6 don't need to be interpreted that way. There's a lot of scriptural support for the idea that angels did sin and they left their immortal bodies in Noah's day. But we do need to do some more work on it because we haven't really accomplished the task yet. We need to grasp the totality of what the Bible says about this matter, at least as far as we can get in a couple hours. It's one thing to tear down arguments against a position, but then, it's another thing to build some support for the position. So when you're trying to understand the meaning of the phrase sons of God, the starting place is to see where else the phrase is used. That's just a good little Bible study tip for you. Where else in the Bible do we find this word or phrase in the same language? Well, since the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the passage in question is in the Old Testament, we're going to have to look at the Hebrew. Where does the same Hebrew phrase occur? Well, once we've done that, it's also going to be important to look into the New Testament, and we're going to see where we find the same English phrase, in this case, the words sons of God. Where is that in the New Testament, and then what does the Greek usage maybe have to show us about it, and how is that phrase used in its context? So those are places that we'll start to try to come to an understanding of this. The Hebrew phrase, B'nai Ha-Elohim, is used only 5 times in the Old Testament. It's consistently translated sons of God in English. And so 2 of those occurrences are in the passage that we're looking at today, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The other 3 of those occurrences are found in Job. So only 2 different books have the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim in the Old Testament. So here's what they are, just to list them off for you. Genesis 6, 2 and 4. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Well, then we move to Job 1, verse 6, which says, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And then Job 2:1 is almost exactly the same. It says, And there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. Yeah, that leaves mystery, doesn't it? Well, then Job 38 says this, On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all of the sons of God shouted for joy? It's talking about the creation of the earth there, and the sons of God are present, shouting for joy as God creates the earth. So, the Genesis uses Genesis 6, is what's up for debate today, is whether that was, created, Elohim, we'll put it that way. Was it the supernatural beings, or are we talking about human beings? So we're debating that one. But this Job 38 passage is not up for debate. It's not possible that any humans were present when God laid the cornerstone of the earth, right? So we know for sure that in that Job passage, it's talking about some kind of supernatural spirit realm based beings there. And we could say the same for the Job 1 and 2 passages, where these sons of God are gathering before the Lord God. And again, we'll address next week what they're doing there, what's happening there. It's the next step. But all of the 3 Job references clearly are talking about something happening in the heavens or in a spiritual dimension. No humans existed then, so they have to be spiritual beings there. Now, if we want to do a more thorough investigation, we would look up similar phrases in the Old Testament. One of them is B'nai Elim, which is very similar. I really have to skim through this to save us some time here, but you can look this up in the notes and see all the different references. But very much it's talking about beings that are in the skies, in the heavens. Where it just makes this very solid case when you look up every B'nai Elim reference that we're talking about heavenly beings. One example for you just for today, Psalm 89, 6 and 7. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? That's heavenly beings there is B'nai Elim. Okay? Yeah, and we'll get into Psalm 82 some more next week. There's some good stuff in here, but again, sorry for skipping some of it. When we look at the English phrase "sons of God" in the New Testament, we're going to find a lot more uses of that than we found of it in the Old Testament. we're going to find that all the references in the New Testament to sons of God clearly involve humans, not angels. It's the reverse. So this becomes actually really exciting because it helps us understand what the term really means, sons of God, and how profoundly this illustrates for us what has been accomplished through Christ in our lives. So Luke 20, verse 36 says, it's talking about humans who are resurrected from the dead. We looked at this already. It says they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Well, Luke uses this Greek phrase, hue theo, a different time actually to identify Adam. Luke's genealogy is of the line of Mary, and in it he traces back the line of Christ all the way back to Adam. And at the end of the genealogy it says he was the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. So there's our Greek phrase here for son of God. Well, the majority of the other times that we find son of God or sons of God in the New Testament, it actually refers to Jesus. But sometimes the term, or a related term, teknatheo, it's not gender specific, so it'd be like the children of God. Sometimes those are used to refer to believers in Christ. So look at these references. Romans 8:14, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Galatians 3:26, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. 1 John 3:1, see what kind of love the Father has given to us that we should be called children of God. And so we are. So what qualifies believers to be called sons or children of God? Well, it's that we experience a new birth. We become part of God's family. That's what makes us his kids, right? That's pretty logical. We are a brand new creation of God. That's what it spells out for us here in 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. So Adam was directly made with God's own hand, right? Out of the dust, out of the dirt, the clay. The body of Jesus was a unique, direct creation of God as his only begotten Son. So the phrase Son of God refers to one who is not born of another, but is born of God himself. That's why it's so very profound that we, believers, are called the children of God, the sons of God, right? We are new, direct creations of the Father. We belong to him. So another way to look at it is that we've given up being the sons of Adam, our old nature. We've given that over, and we've been adopted into God's family spiritually with an eventual physical fulfillment that hasn't happened yet. Let me read this quote from a guy named Douglas Hamp. He says, thus, before the cross of Jesus, there were no sons of Adam, B'nai Adam, that is humans, who were also sons of God. So before the cross, there were no sons of Adam who were also sons of God. The right for humans to become sons of God only occurred after the finished work of the cross. Therefore, all references to sons of God in the Old Testament, that is to say, before the cross and the resurrection, were angels. They were angels because they were direct creations of God. So that explains for us that sons of God is referring to a direct creation of God, and that's why we're called that. That's why Jesus was called that. And so when we're looking at the Old Testament, these sons of God, they were not humans from Adam. They were some from God himself. He had designed them and made them with his own hand. Well, let's go back to Genesis 6 and look at Noah's pedigree a little bit, because there's several other considerations we need to consider as we try to unpack what was really happening in this time leading up to Noah's flood. Well, there's a lot of attention given in Genesis chapter 5 to Noah's line of descent, his genetic line. We're given an entire chapter, okay, to trace this for us, tracing his ancestry all the way back to Adam. And this reveals for us that his bloodline was not tainted by any of that bloodline of the sons of God that were infiltrating the human line at the time. So Genesis 6:9 says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and Noah walked with God. So several translations on the literal end of the scale say, where it says blameless in his generation, it'll say perfect in his generations. And that reflects the Hebrew word there for perfect, which is tamim. So just to give you an example, Young's literal translation, which is very far on the literal end of the scale, says, these are births of Noah. Noah is a righteous man, perfect he hath been among his generations. With Noah hath God walked habitually. So we notice that Noah is described as being both righteous and blameless or perfect. Now, without a doubt, he was a godly man because he obeyed God, he preached God's righteousness to people, he walked with God, but no one suggests that he actually was perfect, like in the sense of being sinless. But the Hebrew word for perfect or blameless is tamim, and that is what is used of Noah. Without blemish, sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired. The same word used to describe a perfect, spotless sacrifice. The physical characteristics of the animals that were allowed to be brought before God and offered as sacrifices. It's that word tamim. It's the same word used of Noah's pedigree. It was perfect, without blame, without spot. The word generations in the Hebrew always refers to genealogies there. It's plural. So our passage is not just saying that Noah was the most righteous man in all the earth, although he probably was. It's drawing attention to who Noah is descended from. Okay. Now, granted, that doesn't prove the angel view. Noah's genealogy is actually important to all of the views, but it's certainly interesting to consider in light of the fact that we're talking about angels coming and corrupting the line of human DNA, right? That it would make the point here, stress the point that Noah was perfect in his generations, that his DNA wasn't corrupted by these other guys. So what it ends up to be is that the Messiah, who is of course the ultimate seed of Eve that God promised through her, that he was the son of God. He wasn't the son of any other spirit along the way. There's no room in the genealogy for the Messiah to have had any of that supernatural incursion from the sons of God involved in there. That's why we're given, I think, such a clear lineage of Noah all the way back to Adam. Let's make note of the stated reason that God rescued Noah. It says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So it's God's decision to give him favor. It was not his righteousness. It was not even his genetic purity that led to his salvation from the flood. He survived because of God's grace towards him. So I just want to bring that up because in all this interesting talk about angels and hybrids and all these other things, which, is interesting and it proves to make important points along the way, but let's not lose sight of the really big deal that God here is showing favor to a human being and including him in his plans, and that's just a wonderful thing for us to elevate as a way that God interacts with humans and something that we just really love about him. Well, I'll make the case here in your notes of why this incursion with the sons of God and the daughters of men was probably not rape of these women. They probably took them as legitimate wives. There's a few things that you can look at to kind of make the case for that, but we'll skip over that for now too. What we want to focus on now is what were the offspring of these unions. I've mentioned the word hybrids. We've talked about them having children with human women. So let's just turn some of our attention onto that. It says in Genesis 6:4, to repeat that here, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So the sons of God were the fathers of the original Nephilim. Even according to the angel view that sees these as sort of half gods, lowercase g of course, half gods, half man, the Nephilim themselves are not considered to be divine or immortal. They're called mighty men, Gibborim. This word Gibborim, mighty man, warrior, is used of humans sometimes. For example, David with his mighty men, it's the same Hebrew word. So we can't make the case just because it uses Gibborim that we're talking about some kind of divine beings here. They're humans, they can die. They were considered to be people, even though we're saying that half of their genetics, at least in the first generation, was from these sons of God who left their habitation and married the daughters of men. We're going to see, though, even though they're considered to be people, they're huge, ferocious people. Many scholars promote the translation fallen ones for the Hebrew word Nephilim. It sort of maybe supports the notion that they were fallen angels, but it's probably not the correct meaning to say that they should be called fallen ones. The Aramaic word is very close to the word Nephilim, and it clearly means giants. Furthermore, when the Septuagint translators, just a little history here, between the time of the Old and New Testaments, there were 70 guys, some of the best Jewish scholars that existed, and they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. so that the Greek-speaking world could read the Bible themselves. And so their choice of words here, when they translated Genesis 6, when they got to the Hebrew word Nephilim, their Greek word of choice was gigantes, which clearly means giants. So during the time between the Testaments, it was understood that these guys, who were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, were considered to be giants. That's why they use the word gigantes there. So giants, in their definition, is one of a race of divine but savage and monstrous beings. So a really curious example in the animal kingdom that could maybe lend some understanding to this is, how could human women give birth to giant babies without dying or exploding or something? I just am the kind of person that wonders stuff like that. So I found it really interesting to find out that in the animal kingdom, you can actually cross a lion father with a tiger mother to produce a liger. Okay. So that doesn't actually occur in nature, but it happens when humans introduce the species to each other, like in a zoo or something like that. So interestingly, the gene that inhibits growth in tigers is found in the male. But in lions, it's found in the female. So when the male lion and female tiger mate together, their offspring does not possess the gene that inhibits growth. So that thing, it keeps on growing throughout its whole lifetime. It doesn't stop growing. People, every other animal stops growing at some point when they reach full maturity, but the liger doesn't because it doesn't have the correct gene. So that's just a possibility of how this could have happened, that the sons of God marry the daughters of men, and if the gene for suppressing growth is in the male, it wouldn't. The male human was not involved, and so there's no suppression of growth, so they keep on growing their whole lifetimes. And then if those Nephilim marry each other, they're the right size to keep having more babies. So there you go. So I don't know if that's what happened, but it's just an interesting consideration that they could have been given birth to normal-sized babies, but then they could have kept growing their whole lives. And those that were born earlier and lived those longer lifespans that were common before the flood could have been even the largest, most ferocious ones than those even born closer to the flood after the gene pool had been diluted a little bit more. So, going back to our verse though, about the Nephilim, they were clearly on the earth before the flood, okay? Genesis 6:4 tells us though that they were also there afterwards. So somehow after the flood, there got to be more Nephilim again. Well, that's what most scholars think that means when it says also afterwards. We're simply not told how Nephilim got to be there after the flood. And there's some different considerations. It's a question I commonly get asked. And so on one hand, I kind of want to avoid this because we don't know for sure. And so for me to pretend I know is kind of ridiculous. But because I get asked this so often, let me just give you the possibilities of what could have happened here. So some believe certain giants survived the flood, either maybe hiding in deep pockets within the earth. Maybe they had some kind of technology, a submarine submersible thing. Maybe there was technology before the flood where there was actually astral travel, outer space travel. So there could have been Nephilim off planet in spaceships during the time of the flood that then came back and, okay. I do consider it possible that the technology before the flood was more than we know it to be now. I mean, all of that evidence would have been destroyed, especially if their energy sources were different from ours. We wouldn't find that in the fossil records. So I think that's possible, but it's a pretty big leap then to say, oh, they were off the planet. I mean, it's pure imagination, so you can't really go any further with that, right? Some Gentile traditions claim that Noah himself was a giant. But the sources that support that have a very clear anti-creator bias, so we really shouldn't be trying to claim that, Noah had giant blood. The sources that claim that tend to believe that it was a good thing to have the Watchers come and give information to humans and that kind of thing. They would also say that the Tower of Babel was a good human endeavor later. So this pro-Watcher theology actually contains the roots of Gnostic thinking. That's what it became later. Definitely should be rejected. So the Bible makes it very clear that Noah's genetics were pure. So I don't think we should make that case that it was through Noah that they came back later. Others think the flood was localized. It wasn't the entire world. And you can do that biblically. That's fair. A lot of times it talks about the world, and it would be the known world. If that were covered with water, well, there could have been other places that the Nephilim existed. I actually have other issues with that just make me really not sure about that as a conclusion, but let me just tell you, really smart people and really firm believers in Jesus Christ do think that the flood was localized. I kind of don't go that way, but there you go. It's not a point on which we need to have big arguments. Some say that the angels who sinned in Genesis 6, we know that they were chained up until the judgment day, so that they could not have come back and married different women and had new Nephilim children. But some say that different sons of God did that. Okay, so other sons of God left their habitation then and had children with human women. So this sort of happened again. I find that kind of unlikely because the punishment was so severe for these first ones to be chained up in gloomy darkness until judgment. I mean, it's really quite a deterrent from doing that again. I also think that the descriptions of the Nephilim that get found later on, which we will touch on here soon, I don't think they were as ferocious and huge and everything as the earlier ones. So I think something else is going on here. One possibility put forth is that maybe one of the wives of Noah's sons had some Nephilim DNA in her somewhere along the line. I actually don't prefer that option at all, because that would mean that a third of humanity would have had to have had Nephilim DNA in them, because there were 3 sons, and so if you populate the earth through those 3 sons, about a third of humanity would have to have Nephilim DNA. And I just don't see it being that much when we get to the stories of the conquest where we see these guys again. I don't think it's that many of them. So I don't think it's Noah's wives. So I'm actually going to go with maybe a really radical, if you made me choose, I'll put it that way. If you made me pick off the list, I'll pick this last one, which is the possibility that humans after the flood, around the time of the Tower of Babel, were doing genetic experiments using people and who knows what, producing a form of Nephilim by modifying the human genome. Genesis 10:8 could hint at something like this. It says, Nimrod began to be a Gibor. That's the singular for Gibborim. Nimrod began to be a mighty man. And the Septuagint translates that as giant. So the Septuagint is telling us Nimrod began to be a giant. And I'm just wondering if perhaps that maybe the sons of God gave technology again, gave information to humans of how to tinker with animal DNA and human DNA and that whole kind of thing. We find that when the Israelites get into the land and conquer certain areas, sometimes they're told to wipe out even the animals of different communities. When humans start to experiment with DNA, what do they start with? Start with animals, right? That's why we have cloned sheep and spiders and pigs and that sort of thing already. Before you get to the human stage, you start with animals. And so I just think maybe there was some genetic tinkering going on, and that could explain how somebody like Nimrod began to be a mighty man. So we'll talk about that a little bit more down the road, but if you make me pick a possibility, there it is. Maybe there's something we haven't thought of yet. It's not a crucial point of how Nephilim got to be there afterwards, but they did. That's the important point for us to know. So none of these suggestions don't have any problems. So, some are worse than others for sure. Bible doesn't specify, so I just don't think we need to limit ourselves to these ideas or pick one at all. But there you go, just for your curiosity, right? Okay, one way or the other though, we do find these guys are there after the time of the flood. Hundreds of years later, when the Israelites came back to the Promised Land, there were Nephilim in the Promised Land. And we've got several references for this, so I'm just going to read them in order to you. You might be surprised by how much information is actually there. Probably, if you've read the Old Testament, when you're reading this stuff, you skim over and you go, what in the world? What in the world is that talking about? Or maybe you just don't even let yourself see it. Now this is going to glow in the dark to you the next time you read. So let me read these. I have 5 references here to read you. The first one is Numbers 13, and it's got 3 different verses from there. It says, they went up into the Negeb and came to Hebron. Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them. So the Israelites are feeling like so small, like grasshoppers, compared to these sons of Anak. He emphasizes that several times, the author, that these are the sons of Anak that they meet. So they're knowing the genealogy of these people, and it's significant who the fathers were. All right, they're knowing. They're talking about these Nephilim as though everybody knows what they're talking about. Well, Deuteronomy 2:10-11 says, the Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Anakim, these are the people from Anak. So the people from the Emim are people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. All right, never mind about Rephaim for right now. That we can go on all kinds of rabbit trails here, but they're talking about these people groups as if they all know what they're talking about. There's something about the descent or the ancestors of these people that are traceable to them, and that isolate them as a peculiar people group that are strong and ferocious and very large. Speaking of large, look at Deuteronomy 3:11. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. So if you do the math on that, 9 cubits is over 15.5 feet long, according to the Egyptian cubit. So it's possible that Moses here, the author of Deuteronomy, is talking about Og's final bed, which would be his coffin. There's no unique word for sarcophagus or coffin in Hebrew other than the word bed. So that would mean his coffin is over 15 feet tall. Does that necessitate that Og was that big? 15? He would have been under 15 feet tall, right? 13 feet, whatever. Was he that big? I don't know. But why would his coffin have been that big? For that matter, if we're talking about the bed that he slept in at night, why would his bed be 15 feet long? Unless he's a pretty tall guy. So it's just surmising from the size of his bed that he's pretty big. Fair enough, right? Look at Joshua 11:21 and 22. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and in Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua cuts these people off. He destroys them, devotes them to destruction. That's another whole area of study that we could do, is what that term means. But notice that they only remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. That's where some Nephilim remained. So there weren't like a third of the human population being Nephilim at this time. There were pockets of them in 3 different places. And then 1 Samuel, which happens later, chapter 17 tells us this about one of these descendants of Anak. It says, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath. Where? Gath, one of those 3 places where they remained. His height was, it says it's over 9 feet is what it ends up to be. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was about 125 pounds. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed about 15 pounds of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. So his equipment is really big and really heavy. He must have been a very large guy. So time doesn't allow us to examine all the different references, but what we can see is there's a group of very large people in Canaan by the time the Israelites get back there. And the biblical authors were familiar with the ancestry of these people. The presence of Nephilim in Numbers chapter 13 was one of the reasons, and arguably the biggest reason, why the Israelites were afraid to go conquer the Promised Land the first time that they got there. After coming directly from Egypt, they got there, saw the Nephilim, they said, we're like grasshoppers to them, there's no way we can defeat them. And so they gave up and wouldn't do it. And that's why they ended up wandering for 40 years. So yeah, they thought it was impossible because these guys were so big and so ferocious. So that's what we see there. So what would be the enemy's purpose for planting Nephilim in this land before the Israelites could get there and take their land? Well, here's something to know about God and about his enemies. He makes promises to people, right? And when God makes promises to people, you can count on his enemies to try to thwart those promises. It's just a pattern that we keep seeing throughout the Bible. For example, Satan targeted the very first humans, and then, by tempting Adam and Eve. And then they had sinned, and then he goes on to their firstborn Cain, and he corrupts him. He learns a redeemer is going to come from the woman, so he starts to attack the very children of the woman to try to get them corrupted. So he gets Abel killed off, and then he gets Cain to be a sinner, and so it looks like he's winning here until, of course, Seth is born, and we've got some new hope. Well, then Nephilim start to appear on the earth. This appears to me to be an attempt to corrupt the bloodline of Eve so that this Redeemer can't come, so that God can't keep this promise. It's not explicitly stated there in the text, to be fair, but it's a reasonable conclusion based on the way the enemy behaves and the potential results of, if he'd been successful here. Well, later on, God gives a real specific promise to a guy named Abraham. He says, not only will the Messiah come from you, but the land of Canaan is going to be your land. This is the promised land. Through you in this land, I'm going to make myself known to the whole earth. I'm going to bless the whole earth through you and this particular land. So, the Israelites get taken in captivity in Egypt, and during that time, there's 400 years from the time Abraham gets the promise until they come back and take the land. And during that time, he's positioning Nephilim in the land to try to prevent God from being able to keep that promise to Abraham. We'll find out later, after Abraham's time, but before Egypt, famine threatens to wipe out the small clan of Jacob. They get taken into Egypt, and there the Pharaoh tries to wipe out the clan by, which is more than a clan now, it's a big, huge group of people. He gives an edict to kill all the baby boys, so we're still trying to wipe these guys out. Later on, God gives an even more specific promise to David. He says, through you, your line, someone's going to be on the throne forever. And so his line starts to get targeted by attacks of various sorts from the enemy, deception and temptations and things like that. Later on in history, we find Haman trying to wipe out all of the Jewish people who are captives there in Babylon. So he's trying to, it's Persia by then, but he's trying to wipe out the entire Jewish line. Then we have Jesus coming on the scene, and Satan tries to prevent Jesus from fulfilling God's plan for him. He tries to kill him, uses the people to try to kill him many times, sends storms at sea. He, actually ends up killing him at the cross. Of course, we know that's not a final defeat by any means. So we see this pattern continuing on into our own time. When God gives a promise, Satan tries to thwart the promise. It's just the way that he works. He tried to destroy Israel, so God couldn't keep his promise to put Jesus on the throne of David. He still tries to destroy Israel. Has there ever been a race of people so targeted for complete annihilation? I don't see how there ever has been. Satan tries to prevent the church from becoming what God promised it would be, which is a pure, spotless bride. Satan seems bent on the destruction of humanity at every turn because God loves humanity. God cares for us. And he has exciting plans for us. Satan doesn't want us to be able to fulfill God's plans for us. So that's how he acts. So here, back to this point in history, Israel arrives at the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering, and there's a minefield planted there. There's Nephilim, pockets all over the place. And their assigned task is to confront those people and destroy them. God required the Israelites to conquer and destroy many different armies and conquer many different cities. But there were a few times that he demanded, you need to destroy every man, woman, child, and animal. It seems so severe. We need to realize God's justice and his sovereignty allow him to do whatever he chooses without always explaining to us his reasons for that. He's allowed. If he says destroy all those people, and we want to say, well, that's just not fair, God, that makes you evil. Well, maybe we don't have the whole story. We don't always get the whole story. But in this particular case, we can know they're tracing the lines of these people back to these pockets of non-human things, okay? These men, women, children, and animals, I think were messed with. Their genetics were not fully human, and that would be why God said their utter destruction needs to be accomplished here. As scholarship continues to research this topic, that's becoming more and more of a certain thing, that the groups that were particularly targeted for annihilation were these pockets of Nephilim mixed up DNA people, okay? There were other communities that they took as slaves, others that they booted out, that kind of thing, but only certain ones that they actually devoted to destruction. So that's worth looking into. Realize, throughout the whole Bible, including the Old Testament, God has some severe judgments sometimes, but also notice that when he judges severely, he's also providing rescue for somebody. And so by severely judging these pagan people who were living in the promised land, God is providing rescue for his people at the same time. That's how it will be. If you believe in a rapture, which I do, at the time that we are raptured, that will be rescue for us, but it also begins a time of judgment on the earth. And so that's just one example. The whole Bible, if you go through and trace this theme, that God saves people by judging others. That's just a characteristic of how God works. And you can do that by tracing like a lot of the Bible stories. I'm giving you all kinds of topics for further study. Hopefully you'll grab some of them up. But anyway, we look forward to the day when Satan will be judged and God will have mercy on us and rescue us. But we do realize with, sobriety that our rescue is going to mean judgment for the world too. God's judgment allows people to be protected and preserved. His judgment on the enemies of Israel allowed his own people to be protected and preserved so that he could keep his promise to Eve and have the Messiah come through her eventually. That's true whether these people groups had Nephilim DNA or not. All of them were engaging in heinous pagan practices. They were offering their children to Molech as sacrifices. They were worshiping idols. They were engaged in horrible things. But you know what? So are we today. We offer our babies on the altar of convenience and women's rights and all that kind of thing. There's all kinds of ways that we promote the worship of anything besides God, right? We deserve the same judgment if that's all that it was about back in the time of Israel. So I do think there was more going on here as far as the Nephilim DNA that God was seeking to wipe out. Really, it shouldn't be God's judgment that actually shocks us. It should be the fact that he shows mercy at all ever and that he does it so frequently. So I'm just trying to make the case in from a few little angles that to try to use the conquest period of Joshua to make a case that God is cruel or unjust is actually missing some information. So this doesn't really complete the whole picture of God and why he judges and how, but it adds some elements that help us understand a little bit better. So sometimes God judges completely and severely. Other times he seems much more patient. Maybe he uses forms of judgment that seem less dramatic to us from our human perspective. Sometimes his worst judgment is handing humans over to what they ask for. Like giving you what you want can be actually a more severe judgment than utter annihilation sometimes. God always has good reasons for his judgments, for the timing and the severity that he uses. He just doesn't have to tell us what those are, but I do think our understanding of this whole Nephilim phenomenon can give us insight into why God did something so drastic as sending a flood in Noah's day to destroy all of humanity except the ones on the boat, right? Later commanding Israel to completely destroy all these people groups. This gives some insight that there's something else going on here. Let me read to you a quote here from Mike Heiser's book, Dr. Michael Heiser from Unseen Realm. You'll hear me quoting this a whole lot more as time goes on, especially in the next lesson. He says, understanding the trauma of Israel in Numbers 13 is essential to understanding the subsequent conquest accounts. Any Israelite or Jew living after the time of the completion of the Hebrew Bible would have processed the wars for the Promised Land in terms of this passage, Numbers 13 with the Nephilim, since it connected Israel's survival as the people of Yahweh with the defeat of the Nephilim descendants. He's got a newer book that really examines this even more closely called Reversing Hermon, where he really traces these people groups to Nephilim groups. So you can read that if you want more evidence of that. Interestingly, the complete destruction of these groups was not accomplished by the time that Joshua died. The Anakim, Rephaim, Amim, and Zamzamim, all these people groups, maintained strongholds in what we now call the Golan Heights, Hebron, and the Gaza Strip. So these places became part of Philistia later, where the Philistines were like Israel's biggest enemy for a number of years. Later, that's exactly where we see Goliath emerging from, is Philistia, and to terrorize God's people. So they keep at it. They keep at the same job they've been at all along. I don't believe it's a coincidence that good old Caleb was only one of the only 2 faithful men who survived the 40 years of wandering, because he thought they should go ahead and attack and enter the promised land in spite of these Nephilim. He says, well, we can take them on, we have God, right? So it's actually kind of funny when they get to the promised land and Caleb's like in his 80s. It's time for the land to be distributed among all the different tribes and clans. And this is what Caleb says in Joshua chapter 14. It says, I'm still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said. Then Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb for an inheritance, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. And it says, now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. Interestingly, Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. And so Caleb asks for this place where the Nephilim are still mighty and strong. And he's in his 80s, but he says, you know what? Same God that I believed would let us take him on way back 40 years ago, I believe he's still all-powerful to do it. He can even use an old guy to do it. In fact, he's kept me strong all these years, probably so that I can take care of that business. So Caleb is determined to go after these last remaining pockets of these Nephilim who lived there in Hebron. I think that's pretty cool and shows pretty dramatic focus and an understanding of how these hybrid peoples were violating God's very nature, and they were so hostile to the true God that he knew that they needed to be annihilated. I think that's kind of cool. Well, so I've demonstrated for you that the angel idea is consistent with Scripture. You may be struggling with it though, because it's an idea that maybe you've never heard before. I want to assure you that I'm not bringing a topic like this to your attention just because it's interesting, because to get some attention for myself as being someone who talks about this. It's sensational, all of that. It's because I believe it's true, and I think the truth may have been hidden about this, and that the enemy would even have an agenda for keeping people from realizing this. We've really separated out the supernatural understanding of the Bible from our view of it, and I think that actually helps the enemy's purposes more than ours to cover stuff like that up. So, when truth about the enemy and his tactics get hidden, he can operate in stealth mode a lot easier. So, I just see how this could help the enemy's purposes to keep this kind of truth buried, to keep people remaining unaware of how he behaves. So, when we consider it absurd that angelic beings would come and procreate with humans, we tend to relegate Satan's activity only to things like mind games or temptations, or making it so we can't find our keys or things like that, right? He could do stuff like that. He could have tried to affect our lives and certainly tempt our minds and that kind of thing. But when we disregard the big stuff, we're minimizing the way that he actually can interact with our world. Then we can't see it for what it is. So I think in many ways, like I said, the church has stripped the supernatural out of the Bible because of our Enlightenment mentality that everything has to be able to be proven with the senses. And we soften those stories sometimes. We try to demystify those stories so that we don't look so weird. We make them symbolic so that other people don't think that we're really strange for believing this kind of thing might be true. The story of Genesis 6 was not always viewed as just humans interacting with humans like it often gets taught in seminaries today. Until the latter half of the 3rd century AD, so a couple hundred years after Christ, nearly all Jewish and Christian texts and commentaries communicated this understanding that the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6 were hybrid beings from the gods and from men. They were the offspring of a divine-human cohabitation, sexual union, and that these guys were giants, these Nephilim. So, traditional rabbinic literature supported that view. That's what they believed. So do the other oldest sources. Now, just because it's the oldest view on record doesn't make it true, of course. We need to do our homework and find out if that's true. But when the evidence is stacked up to consider how and when the other views came to the forefront, it's pretty logical to conclude that the older sources were reporting the thing that had actually happened, and that there are reasons that the newer sources kind of tried to change that to help public opinion about these ideas. So I want to take a look at a couple of these older sources so that you can see at the time of Christ, this is some of the material in existence, and it affected what the rabbis believed, what other writers believed about reality. So let's start with that first Enoch book that we've alluded to a few times. Of course, like I said, the source can't be directly attributed to Enoch, certainly in writing. I mean, because the oldest manuscript we have is nearly 200 years before Jesus. It can't be taken as inspired scripture. It didn't pass the criteria to be included in the canon, and I think that's rightly so. Jude quotes it though, so that gives evidence that he and his readers were familiar with First Enoch, at least the edition of the work that existed in his day, which may be different from the one that exists in our day. 10 fragments of First Enoch were found in Qumran. So here's just a few tidbits of what First Enoch, the information that it shares with us. It says that the sons of God who married the daughters of man are called watchers. That's the term that Enoch used for them, as watchers. It says the number of watchers who did that was 200. So 200 of them, he claims, left their oikoterion and had sex with human women. Now, some fragments of First Enoch give names for the giants. It names them as like their people. It says when a giant was killed, they could be killed various ways, like the flood killed a whole bunch of them. They could be killed, they were cannibals, according to Enoch, and so they would eat each other. Archangels killed some of them, it says. And so it says when they died, only the human side actually died. The watcher part lived on. The part that came from that son of God who had married the woman, the watcher part lived on and came out of the body. So Enoch claims that these watcher demons, the spirits of the Nephilim, could assume many different forms. That part that lived on could take on different forms and look like different things to people. Enoch claims that these beings want to be worshipped, so they solicit and receive sacrifice as gods. According to Enoch, 1 Enoch chapter 8, the watchers taught humans about weaponry, metals, jewelry, herbal medicine, cosmetics, precious stones, dyes, enchantments, astrology, astronomy, and meteorology. So some of that stuff may be helpful to humans, some of that stuff destructive, and certainly occult kinds of things. So they were giving humans special knowledge. Enoch claims that the offspring of the watchers, these Nephilim giants, began to sin against the birds, the beasts, the reptiles, and the fish. It says they devoured each other's flesh and drank their blood. So sinning against these things, again, gives the implication of messing along the lines of genetics. So this third point, just to clarify it, that First Enoch says that when the Nephilim died, their spirits came out and only the human side died. That was the old understanding of where demons come from. Did you catch that? That demons then would be the spirits of these hybrid offspring. And the idea is that God didn't make a place for these offspring to go. He made human souls to go in human bodies. He didn't make a place when these guys died for their souls to go. So they wander the earth and try to inhabit people and other things and appear as other things and all that. So let me just read you the quote from 1 Enoch 15 where he makes this claim quite boldly. It says, "And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth shall be their dwelling." So saying there's no place for these guys, God didn't make a proper dwelling for these guys, because he didn't design them in the first place. Then it goes on, "And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble." Sounds just like demons, right? "They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. So he's giving a potential reason here that he believes to be true, the author of this anyway, of why demons keep tormenting humans, because they came from humanity, and yet they're disembodied and they're upset about that. So they keep trying to wreak havoc against humanity. Makes a lot of sense. I think that provides the best possible explanation of where demons come from and why they inhabit people's bodies. Many of older commentaries agree with that, and so you can look up some of that in the notes. Well, in our own time, several researchers have speculated that the reason the Nephilim spirits have nowhere to go is because God did not create those spirits. They seek to find a place to rest, which incidentally is exactly what Jesus said about them, how he described them. Luke 11:24-26, this is Jesus talking. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, and finding none, it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So this explanation of the origin of demons, it also gives a possible reason for why some demons are stronger than others. That's what Jesus just mentioned there, that's going to find others more evil than itself. The first generation of Nephilim would have been half angel, half human, right? So those would have been like particularly large, ferocious, powerful ones. And then as they intermarried with each other, it would be less and less of the divine component with each other as the line went on. So maybe that's how we get some of that hierarchy among the spirit world. It's just a maybe. It's just something to think about, again, because some of us are curious to wonder about stuff like that. But it certainly also gives us a likely reason why demons are seeking always to inhabit people, why we find Jesus casting demons out of people, and why we even see demons harassing and trying to possess people today, is they need a place to live. Their place to live died, and so they're trying to find a different one. You know, think of how when Jesus cast the demons out of the demons called Legion out of that guy, and they're like, please don't send us into the abyss. You know, they don't want to go there. That's not where they belong. Could you please send us into that herd of pigs? And so they go into the herd of pigs. So they can go into animals, maybe not for long though. It seems that humans are a better match maybe for a place for them to live, because guess what? They're half human or part human, depending on where in the hierarchy they might be. So that maybe that's why inhabiting a human actually works for a while, where when they went into the pigs, they ended up like going off the cliff with the pigs because that didn't really work as well. So yeah, some what ifs, but it's stuff to think about. All right, other sources that mention this sort of thing, the Septuagint is one of them. Now, the Septuagint translators didn't always get things right. Let's be clear about that. They're humans, and you know I don't always think the Septuagint translation is absolutely the best ever. It's always worth considering for sure to see how they understood things. But you know, these scholars from the 3rd century BC, they clearly had an opinion about Genesis 6 and what was happening there. So again, the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It would have been circulating among the apostolic churches. So the early church was largely Greek speaking, and so they would have read their Bible, even their Old Testament books, they would have read the Greek version, the Septuagint version for the most part. And the Septuagint translators clearly took the Hebrew word Nephilim and used gigantes, or giants. Gigantes at that time in classical Greek literature commonly referred to creatures who were half God and half man. Really interesting. Doug Hamp says, if the translators of the Septuagint didn't want us to think about demigods or men of enormous stature, they surely picked the wrong word. Considering the exposure those Alexandrian Jews must certainly have had to Greek literature and the numerous stories of giants, we would be completely ignoring their testimony if we were to understand the word as anything other than creatures who were hybrids of fallen angels and humans, who were also of colossal stature. So he's saying these Septuagint translators knew the Greek literature, and they on purpose picked a word from Greek literature that meant hybrid God-man kind of things, okay? Josephus is another important source to look at. A lot of what we know about the fall of Jerusalem and Jewish history prior to the 1st century actually comes from this guy named Flavius Josephus. So note that that he acknowledges that Seth's line was initially righteous, but he never connects the sons of God to the line of Seth. Instead, he states very clearly that Seth's descendants became wicked, that the angels were the ones who had children with human women. So we can't even claim that the line of Seth stayed good, according to Josephus. Here, let's just read what he says so you have the context. Now, this posterity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations. But in the process of time, they were perverted and forsook the practices of their forefathers and did neither pay those honors to God which were appointed to them, nor had they any concern to do justice towards men. But for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness. So the line of Seth did not stay godly, all right? Whereby they made God to be their enemy. For many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons that proved unjust, and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians called giants. But Noah was very uneasy at what they did, and being displeased at their conduct, persuaded them to change their dispositions and their acts for the better. But seeing that they did not yield to him, but were slaves to their wicked pleasures, he was afraid they would kill him, together with his wife and children, and those they had married. So he departed out of that land. A little understatement there, built a boat and got on it, and the world was destroyed. So that's what Josephus, that's how he interprets what happened back there in Genesis 6. There are many respected early church fathers that taught the angel view. This includes Philo of Alexandria. I'll give you you can look in the notes for the dates that these guys lived. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, Tertullian, Lactantius, Ambrose, and Jerome. So those guys, of course, expressed some ideas that I don't think are correct, that many scholars don't think are correct. So they're not perfect, infallible people, but their commentaries lend support to this claim that Genesis 6 was generally understood to be this hybrid situation going on, this mingling of angels and humans. Philo is actually a pretty interesting and important example. He was a Jewish philosopher from the time of Christ. His whole goal was to harmonize the scriptures with Greek history, Greek philosophy, I should say. He used allegory. That was his primary mode of trying to do all this, of harmonizing everything together, was to use allegory. So if there's anybody in the world at the time who would have tried to allegorize the meaning behind who the sons of God were and try to make it not angels, it would have been Philo, okay? That's what he did. He would have tried to not take it being humans and angels. He would have tried to harmonize those to make it humans. But instead he took a completely literal approach to that event. He said, "And when the angels of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, they took unto themselves wives of all whom they chose." He's quoting Genesis 6:2 there, and then he goes on, "Those beings whom other philosophers call demons, Moses usually calls angels, for they are souls hovering in the air." So he's kind of doing this is what demons are in his explanation. Another source we could look at to see what they believed is called the Book of the Giants. Fragments of this book were found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's dated between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The Book of Giants parallels 1st Enoch in some ways, acts as an additional commentary on Genesis 6. It's kind of a broken up text. I'm actually not going to read it, but you can see it's just supporting the same kinds of things. Another source that we have to look at is the Book of Jubilees. This parallels the Genesis account. It has a lot more detail to it. It was well known to the early church, the Book of Jubilees. There were extensive fragments of this found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than were found for most of the books of the Old Testament. There were copies of the Book of Jubilees. The oldest copies are about 100 BC, but some claim that it's much older than that. So it seems that the author of Jubilees was aware of 1st Enoch as a text, and this book was held in very high regard. Many early church fathers quote the Book of Jubilees. It was not considered to be scripture, but they held it highly. And guess what? Jubilee says the same thing. Yes, I'll read that one to you. "And it came to pass when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the angels of God saw them on a certain year of this Jubilee, that they were beautiful to look upon, and they took themselves wives of all whom they chose, and they bare unto them sons, and they were giants. And lawlessness increased on the earth, and all flesh corrupted its way, alike men and cattle and beasts and birds, and everything that walks on the earth. all of them corrupted their ways and their orders, and they began to devour each other, and lawlessness increased on the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of all men was thus evil continually. So you see, it's all stacking up that this is what the people believed to be true. There's another Qumran fragment. There's a work called the Genesis Apocryphon. They all say kind of the same things, all right? So just demonstrating that the angel view was the common view throughout history. There's several others. We could also quote early church fathers and show, I just mentioned some of their names, but we could go into their quotations and give support for all that. But it's important to note that the belief in angels procreating with humans, it's embodied in the mythologies of many, many ancient cultures, not just people writing from an Old Testament point of view. That's what we would expect if it actually happened, that it wouldn't only be the biblical Hebrew authors or those commenting on it that would have thought this. You would think if things were coming from a spiritual dimension and having children with women, that this would show up in the stories of the world. Maybe not in an unmythologized form like the Bible is giving us, but we would think it would show up in the stories. Well, sure enough, it does. It does. All around the globe, at various times throughout history, we find some of the same ideas. Just a list here of some that you can definitely look up stories for these. Ancient Sumer, very important one because this is the culture right around the Tower of Babel. When human history started to first be written down, this is what they were claiming, stories about demigods and half god, half man kind of stuff. Assyria, Egypt, Inca traditions, Mayan traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one worth considering, which we will later on in the course. Persia, Greece, India, Bolivia, the South Sea Islands, American Indians, all of these cultures have stories along these lines. That's what we would expect to be true if it really happened. If these cultures didn't have stories, that would be weird. You'd have to think, well, maybe the Hebrews just made this up, right? So what about archaeological evidence for giants and that sort of thing? Well, archaeologists have unearthed figurines of Mesopotamian Apkalus, which are their counterpart to the biblical sons of God. So these were built into the foundations of walls or of buildings to ward off evil powers, that sort of thing. The Mesopotamians called them Matsare, which means watchers. So they made little figurines of these guys that they called watchers, and the stories are comparable. So, bones of giants, though, can we find those? I've never seen one. If I did, I'd really have trouble believing that it's true. I would think somebody's claiming to have the bone of a giant. I would be very skeptical. It's very, very easy to fake anything nowadays. I don't know if you've noticed that. We live in a Photoshop world. People can make things look like whatever they want them to look like. And it also seems to be an age in which people delight in making these elaborate hoaxes. So very hard to believe live news nowadays. So, but it does seem like if we're going to make the claim that giants lived on this earth, shouldn't there be some archaeological evidence? Josephus claimed that evidence was in existence during his time back in the 1st century. He said, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left the race of giants, who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men, that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men. So Josephus is saying that in his day, you could still see the giant bones. Now, can we today? It would make sense if we couldn't, because bones don't last that long. It would be really unusual to have bones lasting from the time of ancient Israel and the conquest period. Bones just don't last that long. So not having giant bones is not evidence that the giants didn't exist. We wouldn't expect giant bones to exist anymore. Now, there are more recent claims that there are giant bones. Buffalo Bill, William Cody, actually reported in his autobiography in 1871 that the Pawnee Indians had given him a huge thigh bone. The expedition surgeon had determined that this was from a human. It says it was so large they had to leave it behind as they had no wagon. And then he tells the legend of the Indians. You can look that up. But so Buffalo Bill Cody claimed that he saw one of these huge bones. Doug Hamp, in a book that I've referenced a couple times, he acknowledges that seeing isn't always believing. And so he actually pulled together some articles from older newspapers before Photoshop that had pictures of giant skeletons and things like that, so that, if anything is more credible, it's these older ones. But even so, we can't really know. The thing is, on the internet nowadays, there's so much archaeological evidence that it just gets a little bit ridiculous. And I would say certainly many, if not all of those, are fraudulent. The claims that we're seeing giant bones. I think that it would serve the enemy's purposes very well to make this whole issue obfuscated, so we can't really know, and also to have claims that these are giant bones and then later find out that it was just a hoax makes the whole idea look ridiculous. So I think by creating forgeries, that actually serves the enemy's purpose. So I'm not ever going to be a giant bone chaser. I can believe that this was the case with the Nephilim, even if I never have evidence of an actual giant bone, because again, it doesn't disprove it by not having giant skeletons existing in the 2000s of our progression of history, right? So I just think it's actually more dangerous to chase all the supposed mysteries about it, because we can just be made to look really foolish by believing stuff that gets proven to be hoaxes. Okay. Well, what does any of this even matter? Let's kind of close out our time together by talking about that. So again, my clear conclusion by analyzing all the evidence is that the sons of God were beings that originated in the spirit world, that intersected with the material world. The stated purpose was they were attracted to human women. That's what Genesis 6 tells us. Yet I think a deeper underlying motive was to prevent God from keeping his promise to send a redeemer through Eve's physical bloodline. So for me, finding out the truth of a matter so that I can better understand a difficult passage of scripture is plenty of reason to do that. That's enough. If that were all it is to be able to understand what's really going on here, that would be enough reason to study it. At least to spend 2 hours of your life on a Bible study like this one. I think it's reasonable to do that. I wouldn't say we should have this as our primary focus, always talking about giants and Nephilim and all this, maybe eclipsing the larger picture of the gospel. That would be a bad thing if we put all our attention here. But everything in the Bible is there for a purpose, and sometimes the really weird parts have things to help us understand other deeper truths. So it can be exhilarating to mine for details about these subjects that are less familiar to us, and that help to connect some pieces of the puzzle for us. But I do think there's more important reasons to explore this topic that go beyond just the thrill of discovery and knowing. So these might not seem obvious at first glance, but the implications of the conclusions I'm making actually are going to unfold more and more throughout the rest of the course, and especially as you look at the world through this lens. So for one thing, as we seek to form a coherent worldview, like we talked about building our shelf system that takes into account all of our experiences and observations, we find the Bible's the only source that can actually accurately explain what's going on. So for example, a secular worldview says humans are basically good, evolution is moving us towards greater complexity, but like we find in reality, like tiny toddlers aren't good, at least mine weren't, I don't know about yours. They're very inclined to sin, very inclined to rebellion, to getting their own way. In society, even the human genome, it's all breaking down. It's not getting better and better as time goes on. It's entropy keeps happening. So reality is in line with how the Bible describes it, not in line with, how the scientific worldview likes to describe it, the evolutionary worldview. It's in line with the effects of the curse are seen in our world. Our modern world and even the church at times are directly influenced by Enlightenment thinking. This attempts to surgically remove all traces of the supernatural from our approach to science. If it's supernatural, it can't be right, because we have to be able to measure it with our senses, right? That's the thinking. And even as Christians, this is very much in our psyches. We've been trained on this since we were very, very young children. But the Bible states that the spirit world does interact with the human world, with the physical world. So we should take that into account when we interpret the Bible. Instead of us starting from the assumption that there can't be supernatural, we should take the biblical assumption, because it's been proven to fit reality, that it really could be a piece of the puzzle here. So that's one reason I think looking at Genesis 6 and acknowledging the supernatural component is actually going to help us in our lives, is reopening our mind to the supernatural activity of God and other beings with our physical world, because I think that's how it really is. Well, this all comes into play when it comes to the sons of God and Nephilim in a whole bunch of ways. So one way possibly is consider some of the massive structures around the world. The pyramids, Stonehenge, the Baalbek Temple. I do think that in most of these cases, if not all of them, you can look at how humans could have had technology that they just, they could have built these things in ways we just don't currently understand how they did it. So I don't think there has to be a supernatural component at all. But when you watch like the Discovery Channel shows on these or whatever, they're trying to make it be that aliens came from outer space and helped with these things. Well, it doesn't have to be something like that. It doesn't have to be this great big huge mystery. If we know that there were great big huge ferocious giants during these times, they could have helped build some of these huge structures much more easily. So it's just one possible component of some of those things. We don't have to resort to an alien gospel or an alien worldview or total mystery. We could say, hey, if these guys were there, maybe they had a hand in some of this stuff. So the bottom line is that with all the current TV programs about the mysteries of the world, keep in mind that a coherent biblical worldview does leave room for supernatural things. Things that are unacceptable to modern science and that modern scientists might not be looking at. Things like demons, giants, angels who did physical things with the material world. Those things are in play. However that works out in any given situation, I'm not sure, because we weren't there, but there you have it. The angel view also helps us understand some bigger picture themes in the Bible, and also some smaller details about the Bible that otherwise we're just left scratching our head. We're just left without answers. Sometimes we're even told by our pastors and Bible teachers not to try to find answers on those things. It's too hard for you to understand. I don't buy it. I think regular people can understand this, and that it's actually a pretty simple explanation once you acknowledge the supernatural component of it. So one major theme of the Bible is this conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, as God is seeking to restore Eden to the earth. The fellowship that he had with humans in Eden, he's trying to get that back. And the story recorded in Genesis 6 provides a pretty important level of understanding about how progress towards that end that God had promised to Eve was impeded, and it looked like all was lost. That God couldn't keep his promise to Eve because there's not going to be any humanity left that's not corrupted. Well, I think this is a pretty interesting vignette here in the Bible showing us that God is going to get his way. When he makes a promise, he's going to find a way to keep it. So as I mentioned earlier, this supernatural worldview of Genesis 6 also gives us a plausible explanation for where demons came from. It shows us how they're different from other past powerful evil sources. Evil forces, I should say. Like Daniel mentions the Prince of Persia once in his book. And so what is that? How do we have a hierarchy? How does this all work out? Well, this understanding of what's going on behind the scenes is going to lend some help towards that. How can some be more evil than others? All of that, I think it helps us with that. When we see demons are the forbidden, they're the roaming spirits of forbidden unions is what they are. And then we begin to recognize their limitations. When we think, oh, they were part human, we start to reduce the idea of their power in our lives. And when we believe God's more powerful than them, they have less ability to influence us. So that's a good thing, to be able to realize where they come from. When we understand what was going on in Genesis 6 properly, I think that helps us understand why and how we find these giants in Canaan, like Og and Goliath. Along with that, it gives us some background of why God commanded certain people to be annihilated, including the women, children, and animals, right? So I think that's really important. Yes, they were involved in pagan practices, but there was more to it. And I think that's a pretty important piece of the puzzle to help us understand how and why sometimes God does the things he does. So for that matter, the presence of hybrid Nephilim gives us a much better explanation for why the flood had to happen at all. Why was there a need for such a dramatic reset right then. Why would God have done that? Because humans have gotten to be evil all over again, haven't they? Well, not the same as the conditions before the flood. It's not gotten to that point again, right? So the reset at the flood, we just can understand that a lot better of why that was necessary. Sorry, I live by the freeway, and so you've probably been hearing the traffic noise. That picked my quietest room. So there you go. Anyway, when we understand what was going on there with the Nephilim, we can understand why, the reason for a flood. The things that people were doing, let's just say the things that the sons of God, if they were just the godly line of Seth, or if they were just the royals, they keep doing the same things ever since, but there's not been another flood. There hasn't had to be another reset. So it seems like it must be something more to explain why there had to be such a dramatic thing there. Another thing that understanding the supernatural thing and what's going on with the sons of God and the daughters of men, it helps us understand some New Testament passages too. And we'll get there a little bit more as we progress. But think of verses like 1 Corinthians 11:10. Let's also not forget about our 1 Peter 2 and our Jude passages regarding the sin of the angels. And the authors there assuming their readers knew what they were talking about. Those are just so much better understood in light of the angel view than any other way that we can just maybe skip over them, okay? Well, one of the main reasons that I think it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of our time in our lives looking at this issue, to understand this topic, is because I think it's foolish to remain ignorant if God's enemies are capable of such a thing. If they could do that, leave their habitation and come and cohabit with human women, shouldn't we know that about how God's enemies work? It makes us uncomfortable, but we should acknowledge that a great deal of evidence actually points in that direction. So even if you still disagree with me, it should at least be obvious that you can't be dogmatic against this view. There's a lot of evidence in favor of it. So just suppose for a moment that it's correct. Don't we help the enemy's cause by covering this up and behaving as though he can't do this, as though the sons of God couldn't have done this? Let's not allow them to operate in stealth mode as they try to physically interact with humans, however they do it throughout history. Well, as we proceed through Choose You This Day, we're going to see that this mixing of kinds is going to interrelate with many other things and ways that the devil and his kingdom operates in our world today. And so that's the reason it's necessary for us to lay some groundwork in this particular lesson on this topic. So we're going to be looking into the alien agenda, we're going to be looking at the transhumanist movement, various topics related to music and movies and the occult. This theme is just going to keep resurfacing again and again. So even if you conclude that God's enemies can't mingle their seed with that of humans, you at least need to acknowledge that this idea is very heavily represented in our media today. It's just showing up all the time once you learn to look for it. It's good to be able to recognize it. It's a ubiquitous theme of blockbuster movies, music videos, even children's books. It's all through it, and that should give us pause. So I, for one, view this modern fascination that I see all over the place with demigods, sentient robotic creatures, this mixing of one species with another that we see all through the media. I see that as the ancient ideas with a 21st century twist. I'm not trying to make claims about what may or may not be happening for real in our modern world. I'm saying that it's so strongly represented in our media that to recognize that this is going back to very old ideas is a helpful thing as we try to construct an accurate worldview. Okay? A final reason that I think it's important for us to study this a little bit is because it has pretty significant implications when it comes to how we interpret prophecy. What do we believe God's enemies are currently doing or will do in the future in the last days? Jesus said his return would come at a time when things are as in the days of Noah. He said that in Matthew 24:37. Now, I've seen many prophecy teachers maybe get a little carried away with this phrase, and they're kind of missing the stated point of the reference sometimes, which is, in the last days, people are going to be going on as though nothing's any different. They're going to be marrying and giving in marriage, eat, drink, and be merry. They're just going to be going about their lives, and suddenly judgment's going to come on them when least expected. But I don't think it's it's best to just ignore that there were unique conditions of the world in the days of Noah. Unique in that there were all of these Nephilim hybrid beings like taking over the earth and being ferocious and horrible there. So, Jesus could have used a lot of other scenarios of judgment to make his point. He could have said, it'll be like in the days of Belshazzar, when he was just eating and drinking and having a party, and all of a sudden disaster came upon them. That happened in one night, So he could have used other examples. Now, I don't think that Jesus' reference to the days of Noah can be used as proof that in the end days there's going to be another attempt at hybridization between the gods and men like there were. You can't prove that. Certainly can't prove that it would happen in the same way, but we know the devil doesn't have a limitless bag of tricks, and he tends to recycle some of the stuff with a different twist on it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are attempts at genetic engineering or things like that with humanity going on. I wouldn't say that the sons of God are having sex with human women again and that there are hybrid Nephilim existing, but I wouldn't put it past him to try to use some of the same ideas to corrupt the human bloodline so that God can't keep his promises, right? So I think that's is going to affect how we think about how things happen in the future. It's worth considering. It would actually be unlike Satan to not try to do something similar again. So really, it's not my goal to make everybody worried about something like that. What might he be doing? I'm trying to put the devil and his kingdom into their proper place and show that they are limited, finite beings that can't keep coming up with new ideas. They can't create anything on their own. So they manipulate things and all that. All right, so that was a lot to cover. Sorry, I think I took a little long because there was no clock stopping me, so hopefully this won't be too long for you to watch. Thank you if you got this far on it. Let me just summarize real quickly what we talked about. There are three main views about the events of Genesis 6, the Sethite view, the royal view, and the angel view. People who love Jesus believe all three of those. The angel view agrees that angels in heaven don't marry, but they can leave heaven and take on bodies. The New Testament has two passages that support that idea, that the angels sinned sexually during Noah's time. The phrase Son of God refers to a direct new creation of God. We're talking about things like Adam, the angels, Jesus as both God and man in one person. We're also talking about believers are the sons of God, direct new creations of God. We said that the offspring of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men were Nephilim. That indicates they were giants. Later Old Testament and other extra-biblical references support that, and a case can possibly be made by archaeological evidence, but that's not so important. We said that demons are likely to be the spirits of these Nephilim, these hybrids. The spirits, only the human side died, the spirit side lived on and tries to inhabit people. And we also said the evil ones are always trying to prevent God from keeping his promises. And that would probably be the crux of why this was all going on. Okay? So that's what we covered today. And I hope that at least you got those main points from it. And again, we'll be building on this in future lessons. So stay tuned for lesson 8. As we get into the divine counsel, it's another pretty important concept. And so thanks for your attention.